Hey, this is Seth from REtipster.com. One of the questions that I get from people all the time is how to figure out what the offer price should be for a property that you're pursuing. So say if you've identified a motivated seller, you're ready to make an offer to them, you have a pretty good idea for what that property is actually worth today or what you would be able to resell it for in the future. But how do you really zero in on what your offer price should be? Well, that's what I created this little calculator for, which you can see at retipster.com/offer price. In fact, you might even be watching this video on that page right now. So I'll just quickly show you how this works. It's pretty self-explanatory, not hard to figure out, but to start with, you want to get a really good idea for what this property is worth or what you think you're going to be able to sell it for at a future date. And this is one of those things, depending on the type of property you're working with, if you're dealing with a house or some kind of a property that's easy to quantify in terms of comparables based on how much income it's producing, it could be really easy to figure out this number. Or if you're working with something like vacant land, like what I do a lot, it can actually be pretty challenging to figure this out. And there are definitely some ways you can do it and get a reasonably close ballpark figure for that. I've got a blog post dedicated specifically on how to do that I'll link to beneath this video. But assuming you've gone through all those steps and you have a pretty good idea for what that property is legitimately worth, you would put that number right up here. In my case, I'm actually going to use a real life example of a property that I just bought. So this is a property that the sellers told me it was worth $80,000. In reality, though, after looking at a lot of the data, I think it would legitimately sell on the high end for probably about $40,000. So I'm going to put that in here. And whenever I'm pursuing vacant land properties, typically the offer range that I make is very, very low, usually anywhere from 10 to 30%. A lot of house investors out there might just laugh at that because houses are a little bit different. But again, with the types of properties I'm pursuing, that's the range I'm usually looking at. I don't think I've ever gone higher than 30%. Not that that's never appropriate, but that's just never something I've done. So in this example, I'm going to say 15%. So my offer would be $6,000. And then for closing costs, so this is basically anything you have to pay for in order to take possession of that property. This includes title insurance, any due diligence you might have to do, any property inspections or surveys. Say if there's any back due property taxes or assessments or fees you have to cover as part of the acquisition. All that stuff you would add up and enter right here in this field. Now with the vacant lots, there's not a whole lot going on. If I was closing through a title company and then maybe the cost of getting some pictures and an inspection on the property, I would total all that stuff up in here, and just for the sake of an example, I'll put $1,000. And then down here for holding and improvement costs. So if I was working with a house that I was flipping, I would include all of the costs that I have to pay while I own that property. So this includes ongoing property taxes, all the costs of improvements, insurance, anything that goes wrong, all that stuff would be lumped in here. So for a house, if it's a serious renovation project, heck, you could put $50,000 in here. But again, in my case, I'm dealing with vacant land, and pretty much the only cost that I would have to pay, if I have to pay it at all, depending on how fast it sells, would be the annual property tax bill. And luckily with vacant land, property taxes are typically very, very cheap in the first place. So in this case, I'll put a couple $100 in there. And then for closing costs, we're pretty much just looking at what you're going to have to pay to get this thing through the title company closed and sold to the new buyer. A lot of times when you're closing through a title company or attorney, the buyer and seller will split those costs down the middle, but it doesn't have to work that way. If you wanted to word the contract in a way that both parties would accept it, you could have the buyer pay for all those costs, or you could set it up so that you pay all those costs. It just kind of depends on your situation and how you want to handle that. And I'll also say, if you're using a real estate agent to get your property sold, you'll also want to include the agent's commission as part of this line item. So if you're just selling a normal house, the typical realtor commission on that type of property is around 6% of the sale price. And if you're selling vacant land, the typical commission on that type of property is 10%. It's pretty expensive. So if you're going to have to pay that cost when you're selling this property, don't forget to factor that into this number when you're filling out this particular field. And I can also just say, as a side note, As a land investor, it has been extremely valuable for me to figure out how to sell land on my own without using an agent, especially in the vacant land niche. If you happen to be working in that industry, a lot of the normal real estate agents out there are pretty clueless when it comes to land. They're always thinking in terms of houses because that's the type of property they normally work with. And when it comes to land, they just don't have the network or the know-how to get your property the kind of exposure it needs and really to understand land pricing in the first place. So whatever type of property you're selling, don't forget that there is a lot of value in you being able to sell your own property that you own on your own behalf without using an agent. And while that certainly takes time on your part, I don't want to overlook that. It can also have a big impact on your end results, your net profit, your return on investment, if you're willing to do the work and handle that part on your own. So just keep that in mind. In this case, again, since it's a land transaction and I know how to do this on my own, I'm just going to include the cost of the closing with the title company in here, $500 in there. And then when it comes to the sale price, so it's similar to the market value number you put up here, you want to be really, really honest and make sure you understand as thoroughly as possible what this property is actually going to sell for on the back end. So if you were really conservative with this number when you came up with it, like if you actually have market data to support the assumption that this property is actually going to sell for $40,000, then you could very easily just crank this thing up to 100% and assume I'm going to sell it for $40,000 cash. And then you have your numbers over here. But I know a lot of times, especially with vacant land, it's good to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room and not assume you're going to be able to sell it for that full market value, whatever number you came up with. So just to be conservative, I might put it down here at like 75%. Or if I wanted to be really conservative, I could put it down here at 50%. But at the end of the day, whatever numbers I put in here, the important thing is to look over here and see the results of the numbers you input over here on the front end. So first of all, what this is telling us is that our total cash investment in this property is going to be $7,700. And essentially, this is just adding up our offer price plus the closing costs plus the holding and improvement costs plus the closing costs again on the sell. It's just tallying all that together and saying that based on these figures we put in here, that's how much cash it's going to take to get into this deal. And then the next thing we see here is the net profit number. And that's just taking our supposed sale price here and subtracting our total cash investment. And that gives us a net profit of $12,300. If this actually pans out, that would not be a bad paycheck to get. And then also return on investment, or the ROI. This is just telling us what the return is going to be as a percentage base from the investment that we put into the property. And I think it's pretty important to look at all these numbers together and not to fixate on any one of them. Because, for example, I know whenever I'm doing a land deal, my preference is always to see an ROI of 100% or higher. And obviously, if it can get to 200, 300, 400, awesome. I'll take it all day long. But once it's just getting below 100%, I don't necessarily automatically say no to the deal, but I start getting a little bit less excited. However, another really important thing to look at is what is your net profit going to be? It's not necessarily just about this percentage, but also about practically how much money are we going to walk away from this deal when this thing is all said and done. If I was going to offer, 50% of the property's market value and then sell the thing for 100% of the $40,000 number, you can see my ROI took a beating. Now it's below 100%. But that's still a pretty nice paycheck to make, and that's something worth considering. You also got to consider it's going to cost me a lot more cash. It's going to tie up a lot more money. I'm going to have to put a lot more eggs in this basket in order to get that net profit, and that's what this is reflecting. It's basically just saying that I'm getting a smaller bang for my buck overall, but that still would be a nice net profit to walk away with. So I think whatever kind of property you're dealing with, whatever kinds of economics are at work in terms of what it's worth, how much you're willing to offer, how much you think it's going to sell for, this calculator will tell you very quickly what the results will be of the numbers you put in here. And if you don't like what you're seeing here, you just have to go back to this calculator and start adjusting the numbers until you do like what you're seeing. This can be a really quick way to indicate, hey, you're offering too much money, offer less if you want to get a higher ROI and net profit. Or if your sale price is too low, say, hey, you're going to have to sell it for more. Everything you play with here will have some kind of impact on the numbers you see over here. And obviously, as with any calculator, the quality of your outputs has everything to do with the quality of your inputs. If you don't really know what you're talking about when you put a market value number in here, say if you put a number in there that's way, way, way too high and totally unrealistic, that's going to skew everything else, and it's going to skew your sale price, and then it's going to obviously mess all this stuff up too. So you You want to make sure you're doing your homework and you're not just shooting from the hip, but you actually have some kind of data-driven, educated basis for the numbers you're putting in here in the first place. But if you do, then this calculator can be really helpful just in helping you see very quickly how great or not so great of a deal you're looking at. If you want to use this calculator at any time, all you got to do is head over to the blog post at retipster.com/offer price. Go ahead and bookmark it in your browser, and you can come back and use it whenever you want, free of charge. And I hope you find it really helpful. Thanks a lot for watching, and I wish you all the best on making your next offer.